to you guys with not having processed it at all. So it's going to be helpful to me if you have had time to at least begin chipping away at Mark 8. And what I'll need to do is put that there, I think. Okay, so Mark 8:27 to the end, I think, is the signed portion. Lepete, PowerPoint.
Yes, sir.
Polikala. By the way, if you haven't already discovered the Biblical Language Center, just look in the chat message. Biblical Language Center is a site pioneered by a guy called Randall Booth, who is very, very good. They teach Greek through living language methods. Yeah, I mean, it's an intriguing site, an intriguing concept. One of the contributions that they've made is that they've done quite a lot of work on probable pronunciation of Greek in the 1st century, in fact, across time. But the little link that I've posted into the chat window is, as far as I know, the best current theory on the likely pronunciation of the language during the times of the biblical writers. Pronunciation can be significant because it allows you to pick up things like alliteration, etc. If alliteration, assonance, wordplay sometimes can be picked up if words sound alike. So there is a sense in which sometimes pronunciation has a part to play in understanding a text. And the language went through major changes from the earlier times. Let's say we go back to Homer as kind of the beginning of literary Greek, to modern Greek, which is so vastly different from what they think it was translated or pronounced like in the early days. And the biblical period falls somewhere in the middle of that transition. So the theory is that in some respects it was pronounced like ancient Homeric style pronunciation, and in other respects it was already making the migration to what modern Greek sounds like. So it's an interesting read, not too long, if you are curious. All right, let's begin with reading this passage as best we can. I'm going to try and read through it in about 10 or 15 minutes, and then leave some space to pick up questions as we go. So we're going to do this reasonably quickly by our current standards. Kai ex elthen o Jesus, Jesus went out. Kai hoi mathetai too, and his disciples, estas komas, into the villages, Caesareas, of Caesarea, tes Philippou, of Philippi. Kai ente hodo, and in the way, on the way, understanding in as being on in this instance, at least in English idiom, as they were going is the idea. Eperota, eperota from eperotao. So what's happened to eperota? You can see the preposition in compound. Then we've got the vocalic augment. And we would have added an epsilon connecting vowel, which has been assimilated by alpha. Alpha swallows up the epsilon. Eperota is an imperfect active indicative, third person singular. So eperota, he was asking, questioning. Tous mathetas autou, legon auto is saying to them. Tina, accusative, from tis, accusative of who, so in this case, whom, me, legusin, poianthropoi enai. Enai, the infinitive of emi, to be, So he's asking, whom men are saying me to be? Who are men saying me to be? Hoide epan auto legontes. This hoide, often in the sense of but they, which is the case here. Hoide epan, but they said. You quite often find this with apon. We would expect apon as a second aorist form. You would expect the connecting vowel omicron and then the ending. But what you often find with some of the common ones is that it merges the alpha from the first aorist. So that alpha that we're seeing there is actually, instead of using the connecting vowel R, it's as if they bring in the alpha from the tense formative sigma alpha. Hoide apon, but they said, auto, to him, saying. The idea is they answered him saying. Hoti, hoti often introduces direct speech, sometimes indirect speech. Here it seems to be direct speech. If you use this little version, these tiny little markers indicate textual variance. So this one tells me, if I click on it, tells me Hoti is present in the Westcott Hort version of the New Testament. It's also present in NA 28. It's absent in the Robinson Pierpont majority text form, which is the one that kind of has links to the Textus Receptus that underlies the King James Version. There's another textual variant. So this tells us apon auto legontes is present in Westcott Hort and NA 28, but Robinson, Pierpont, and Trigg have apekrithesan auto, literally they answered him saying, instead of apon they said to him saying. So we've got some minor, pretty insignificant textual variants floating around here. Everybody still there?
Yes.
Okay, so saying, Hoti. All right, no problem, Henny. Just rejoin us when you can. Hoti, saying, Hoti, Ioannein. All right, now, why accusative? Ioannein ton baptistein, kai aloi, Elian, Elijah, others Elijah, aloi de, Hoti, eston propheton. My question is, why is this accusative? Anybody?
Is it not because Jesus is the subject of the sentence and they've been described, he's been described as somebody else as the direct object?
On the right track. The question was, who are they saying I am? So the answer implies they are saying that you are Ioannein. But legusin, su, ine, is left out because it's in Jesus' question. We do the same thing all the time in everyday English. If I say to you, where are you going? You may not answer, I'm going to the shop. You might just say, the shop. So your answer implies that you don't need to repeat the question. You just answer the question directly. But if we put Ioannein ton baptistein into a full sentence that included men are saying you to be, we would then have Ioannein as an accusative to complete that sentence. All right, so saying that, some are saying, yeah?
Normally when we use a me, okay, here it is implied, it would take a predicate nominative. Can you maybe just explain that a little bit? Why it is accusative?
No problem. When it's an infinitive, infinitives will take there are constructions that that have infinitives that kind of have in typical language a subject and an object, but they'll always have them in the accusative case. So even with a me's infinitive form, it's going to take its complement, and if it has a subject, it'll take its subject in the accusative case. All right. So you can see both here. The logic of the sentence is, men are saying me to be whom. So these two accusatives construe with the infinitive form ine, where one is functioning as its subject and the other is functioning as its direct object or complement, if you wish. But because it's an infinitive, they'll both be accusatives. So that's just something you learn. Infinitives take their, I'm putting this in inverted commas, their subject and their object in the accusative case when they have that kind of grammar. All right, so if we were going to put this sentence into ordinary English word order, let's try and rewrite it over here. Try and write the question first. So we've got hoi anthropoi, legusin, me, inai, tina. So the logic here is we've got men are saying me to be whom. So that's the question. The implied answer is hoi anthropoi, legusin, or legusi. Does it have? Yeah, well it does. It doesn't really need it. Se, inai, and our first one would be Ioannein. So you can see this is radically abbreviated to just Ioannein ton baptistein. I'll leave out the Baptist part. But in both cases, these two accusatives are combining with the infinitive form of einai, or eimi. And in combination with the infinitive, they both become accusatives. At the same time, me and the implied se would be accusative because they are also the direct object of legusin. They are saying you to be John. Hope that helps. If it doesn't, I'm not really in possession of better vocabulary to explain it. So.
Thanks, that makes sense.
All right, so hoide epon auto legontes, hoti Ioannein ton baptistein. So they are saying you to be John the Baptist, kai aloi, and other men are saying you to be Helian, aloide, and but others still, hoti, heston propheton, one, don't confuse it with into, of the prophets. Kai autos, emphatic, eperota, we've got some indication here that there are textual variants again. All right. Eperota autus. All right. And he, eperota, once again, imperfect active indicative. So asking, not a one-off. There's some sense of duration to the asking them. Humes, emphatic, humeste, but you. Tina, whom you say me to be. So the same question, but who do you say that I am? Apokrithes is another textual variant. It's not very significant. Apokrithes, hopetros, legeauto. This apokrithes, it's a aorist participle from apokrinomai, meaning literally meaning having answered, but it typically means Peter answered and said to him, Sueho Christos, you are the Christ. They're not marked in this version, but if you dig a little deeper, you'll find there's quite a few variants on this. So you'll have variants like Su Christos, Tu Theu, you are the Christ of God, or Su Christos, or Hios, ton, the living God, Zon Theon, something like that. So you've got quite a few variants. The preparation of the SPL Greek New Testament thought they were so clearly wrong that he didn't even mention them here. Kai epi timesen, from epitimao, he commanded. We can see it's an aorist. We got the lengthen there, we got the augment there, and the tense formative sa, which becomes se in the third person. Epitimesen, he commanded. Autois, them. Epitimesen takes a dative direct object. Hina, in order that, made their knee to nobody. Legosin. Legosin will be subjunctive. Its telltale sign is the hina. Legosin, periautu. He commanded to them in order that they should say nothing concerning him. Or they should say to nobody concerning him, probably. Basically, don't tell anyone about me. Kai erpsato, erpsato from archo, the vila, when it combines with sigma of the aorist tense, gives us xi. So this is an aorist, middle, indicative, third person singular, and it means he began. Sometimes it means to rule, but it often has the sense of he began. So he began, didasken, to teach. That's the present infinitive. Aorist, yeah, would be ingressive, by the way. The word began clearly implies an ingressive sense, but didasken in the present tense implies the teaching was ongoing. Autus, hoti dei, it is necessary. Ton hion to anthropu pola pathen, it is necessary, the Son of Man, many things to suffer. Dei always requires an infinitive. Kai apodoki masthenai, we can see it's aorist passive, and we can see that it's an infinitive from the suffix nai. So to suffer, pola, many things, kai, apo, doki, masthenai, and to be rejected, upoton, presbyteron, the elders, kaiton, archiereon, and the high priests, kaiton, grammateon, and the scribes. Kai, apok, tanthenai, aorist passive again, infinitive again, so diagnostics are very clear. All right, so, and to be killed, from apokteno. Notice the vowel change in the root for the aorist passives. Kai meta tres hemeras, anasthenai from anistemi. It's one of our me verbs. There's our root. The iota is indicative of the present tense, so we don't find it here. Ana, stay is our standard root. And nai is our infinitive addition. So here it's an aorist active infinitive. So, and after 3 days to rise. Am I going too fast? Probably. Apologies if I am. I'll get through this and then we'll leave the rest of the space to pick up things that are bugging you. Kai paresia. And openly, this sometimes means with boldness. You can see it's linked to the word for the appearing of Christ, if you're familiar with the theological jargon of the parousia. Well, it's not hard to see that paresia is linked. So I think it's going to tell us it means openly, outspoken, frank, or plain, openly. Ton logon, elale, elale, clearly an imperfect. And he was speaking the word openly. Kai pros labomenos, from lab. Lambano would be the present. This is the second aorist stem. We can see but it's a middle passive. Aorist, well, actually a middle aorist. Pros labomenos, or Petros, auton, paralambano, normally pros lambano, to receive to promote. What's the nuance of the pros? To take aside. Okay, all right. So to take aside in the sense to take to yourself. So if you take someone to yourself in the corner. Pros labomenos, having taken him aside, or Petros. Erxato, same as earlier, he began. Epetimen, this began always requires an infinitive. This is from epitimao, alpha contract, and this is the standard formulation of the infinitive, to rebuke him. Auto, epitimao, will take a dative direct object as well. Hode, epistraphes, to turn around, epi, strefo, and there's the passive, the epsilon changes to alpha, so this is a strange form. You might want to try and understand that strange form. Kai idon, tus mathetas autu, right, but he, hode, having taken him aside and seen his disciples, epitimesen, he rebuked. Same word as epitiman. Epitiman is, of course, a present infinitive. This is an aorist indicative. He rebuked Peter, still dative direct object, kai lege, and says, historical present. Hupage, opiso mu, hupage, go behind me, satana, or to ufrones, from phroneo, to have in mind, or regard something. Ufrones, tatu theu, the of God, add things, tatu theu, Allah, taton anthropon, but the things of men. So clearly Peter's conception of the role of Christos was not that he is to die, but rather that he is to rule and liberate Israel. And Jesus says that's the human perspective on what would be most beneficial, not God's perspective. Kai proskalesamenos, from proskaleo, to call aside or call to yourself. Ton ochlon, so having called, this is clearly a middle infinitive. There's our tense marker for the aorist, and there is our middle passive infinitive morpheme. Having called aside ton logon, sun tois mathetais autu, epenautois, together with the disciples, he said to them, etis thele, if anyone, we've got again some textual variants, so etis, majority text has hostis, not going to make much difference. If anyone, the overwhelming majority of textual variants, by the way, don't fundamentally change the meaning. Etis thele opiso mu, if anyone wishes, present. It's not a historical present because it's inside of direct dialogue. Opiso mu, after me, elthein, to come, aorist, second aorist infinitive, there's a textual variant there as well. So some of us have elthein, to come, and other manuscripts have akoluthein, to follow. Aparnesas tho, this is an aorist infinitive. There's our aorist addition, there's our third person imperative suffix. So let him deny he auton. This would be a middle passive, I think. Arneomai, but it's definite. He auton. Kai arato, from airo. So airo, the actual root is ar. The iota is added to the present tense stem. And because it is a liquid verb ending in rho, it's formed with simply the tense formative alpha instead of sigma alpha, ato. Once again, third person singular, imperative. So let him take up ton stauron autu, his cross, kai akolutheto, and follow continually moi, me. Oscar eon, but whoever thele ten suchenav tu, sosai, but whoever wishes thele, his life or soul, suche quite frequently just in the sense of life, another fairly meaningless variant. Sosai, to save, from sozo. You can see we've got the root so, the aorist suffix sa, and then the iota for the active infinitive. Apolese. Apolese is problematic. Maybe talk to you about him later if you wish. This is a future tense though. He will lose it. Hostaan, but whoever, de, abbreviated. Apolesi, whoever loses, ten suchena, to his life, henin kenemu, on account of, or for me, my sake, kaitu, evangeliu, and of the gospel, and for the sake of the gospel. So say, he will save. So sozo, future tense marker, connecting vowel, third person singular, was their variant. Some manuscripts add hutos. This one will save it. Doesn't make much difference again. Tigar ophile, for what? What? As a question. Ophile, it will profit. It profits. Actually present tense. For what it profits or benefits. Anthropon. You can see another textual variant. This one strongly agreed by all three of the main ones. So it's just the addition of ton. For what it profits, a man, anthropon, kerdesai, from kerdeo, kerdaino. Alright, got that one wrong. It's clearly an infinitive, it's clearly aorist, active infinitive. There's infinitive iota. To gain, ton kosmon, holon, the world, all of it. Kai, zemiothenai, and to forfeit, you can see it's aorist, passive, and infinitive. And to forfeit or lose, ten suchen of to, his life or soul. Tigar, doi, that's very unusual. That's a subjunctive that has a short omicron. Very unusual. For what? Doi, anthropos, a man may give. Is it subjunctive? No, yeah. Antalagma, in exchange for te suchesav, to his life. Where are we? Oscar eon epais kunthe. Again, we've got aorist infinitive. This is an aorist subjunctive, middle passive. Passive actually, not middle passive. And the telltale sign eon tells me it's going to be a subjunctive. And this the is a fairly telltale sign that it's aorist passive. Right, so for hos eon, whoever, epes kunthe, probably is passive in the sense of being dependent. And I think the idea is to be ashamed of. To be ashamed of me, kaitus emus, and mine words. So my words, ente genea taute, in this generation, te moichalidi kai hamartalo, the adulterous and sinful one. These are attributive adjectives modifying te genea. So it's te genea, this generation, te moichalidi, the adulterous and sinful one, understanding generation. Kai, it probably here in the sense of also, hohios to anthropu, epais hunthesetai. This is future, thes, connecting vowel. The Son of Man will be ashamed, auton, of him, Hotan, whenever, Elthei, he comes, ente doxetu patros, in the glory of the Father of two of him, metaton angelon ton agion, with his holy angels. All right, so that's been a mouthful, but that's more or less the reading of this text. I'm going to throw the floor open for you to ask anything you want to probe.
Kevin, what I've noticed in translating this text is that there's quite a lot of redundancy, especially when it's talking about the disciples replying and saying, and most of the translations leave out the redundancy, as it were. Any comments on that?
I agree. It's a fairly standard feature of language, especially spoken language, but to some extent written language as well, to have a measure of redundancy. The great authority on Bible translation from the late 1900s, sort of 1960 to 1990, was a man called Eugene Nida. And Nida's books claimed that anything up to 50% of a text tends to be redundant. In other words, the texts will have up to 50% redundancy, simply because that's necessary for effective communication. I've never tried to confirm the claim. By 50%, I think he meant not half, but actually a quarter. But be that as it may, yeah, there is a certain measure of redundancy, stuff that can be left out, etc. So it's perfectly normal, especially in introductory phrases like he answered and said, that kind of stuff. So if you're translating very literally, you'll try and keep all those words in your translation. If you were translating slightly more idiomatically, you would leave them out. So Gary, yeah, there is, and it's just the nature of written communication, or the nature of verbal communication.
Great, thanks.
Okay, open floor.
Given on the subject of redundancy, there's, if we look at verse 29, Wallace seems to, when he discusses the aorist participle, which in that case is apokryphes, he says here with the present tense main verb, the aorist participle is usually antecedent in time, but then he says a frequent exception to this is when the controlling verb is a historical present and the aorist participle is redundant, referring to Mark 8:29. Can you please just give us a little bit more insight on that? Because to me, the aorist participle is not redundant in the sentence, but I know way too little to be able to say that I'm right.
Okay, so ordinarily, an aorist participle represents an action that takes place before the action of the main verb. Sometimes they are happening at ostensibly the same time, but at least logically it tends to be before the action of its main verb. Before I do Mark 8:29, let's go and look at a couple of other examples of aorist participles in our passage, because there were a few. Let me just try and find one or two. All right, so if we come here, he spoke the word openly. Now, look at this sentence. Kai proslavomenos or Petros afton. So, Peter, having taken him aside, aorist participle, erxato epitimanoto, began to rebuke him. So, aorist participle, main verb. It's clear that the order of events is Peter took him aside and then began to rebuke him. So the action of the aorist participle is antecedent to the action of the main verb. He took him aside, or after he had taken him aside, he began to rebuke him. Right? Simple enough. Here's another one. So this is Jesus' response, epistraphis. he turned around, something like that. All right. Aorist participle, that's passive, but that's irrelevant. Kai idon, and aorist participle, having seen the disciples, and there's our main verb. So we've got aorist participle, main verb. And by the way, Greek loves to report narrative in this style. It'll frequently have sentences that consist of a series of participles and one main verb that governs the whole clause or the whole sentence. But look at what's going on here. He turns around, sees the disciples, and then rebukes Peter. Notice that logically there's order. This is chronological. The first thing in the sequence is to turn around. So the first aorist participle happens before the main verb, and in fact before the other aorist participle. Then he sees the disciples. So he turns around, sees the disciples, and then he rebukes Peter. So these aorist participles are antecedent. The actions they represent took place before the action of the main verb. It doesn't have to be long before, it just has to be before. And that's pretty standard. Here's another one. Proskalisamenos ton ochlon. So having called the crowd with his disciples, he said to them. So there's our main verb. Proskalisamenos, our participle, having called them, he said to them, or he spoke to them. Obviously, if I want to speak to you, I first got to call you together, and then I speak to you. So the action of calling together is antecedent to the main verb of speech in this case. And that's the default. So your aorist participle denotes action that takes place prior to the action of the main verb in the clause. But this particular phrase, apokrithes, having answered, if we do it literally, it's having answered. And here we've got a historical present legi. Quite often you'll have apen. So quite often they'll use the aorist version apen. Apokrithes, apen auto, having answered, he said to him, is redundant because the answering and the saying are introducing the same speech act. So if I left off apokrithes, having answered, and I just had Peter says to him, you'd have the same meaning. You don't need answered and said. You could have just said Peter said. There is some debate around this. Some people think it's not quite so redundant, but it does seem to have become a fixed formula, a standard way of saying somebody replied or answered a question. Literally, he answered and said, or having answered, he said. But it's clear, yeah, that the answering and the saying are one and the same event. This isn't a prior action that takes place before this. They're one and the same thing. And that's the point that your commentator is trying to explain. So I think it is redundant, and I think it does introduce a single speech act, you are the Christ, and thus they're one and the same event. This is clearly a historical present. Often, apokrithes in this formula will go with the aorist apen. He answered and said, but the function here is the same. Does that adequately answer your question? Or have I added to your confusion?
No, you haven't added. This is, I understand it perfectly now. Thanks, Kevin. What really threw me about that sentence was that the lege auto, most of the translations take that lege as redundant and don't, so the apokrithes gets translated but not the lege. And that is where I battled for the main verb, and I was looking at the sentence and I was really battling to see what Wallace was trying to say, but now it makes perfect sense. Thank you.
I don't think it's that they're disregarding lege. I think it's that they are rendering apokrithes and lege in combination as answer. So answered and says might be converted in English simply to Peter answered him, or he answered Peter, whatever the speaker was. So I think what happens in English is they combine the connotations of answering and speaking into one word that conveys both. It's not this that's the main verb, by the way. If you're going to leave anything out in the sentence, you have to translate legi. You've got to translate he says. You can't have Peter having answered him, you are the Christ. All right. Anything else?
I think just a general comment from my side, Kevin, is that, you know, compared to the John chapter 1 text, that this seems somewhat an unremarkable text from a Greek perspective, and maybe I'm missing something, but not necessarily finding anything that's, you know, compared to the previous text that we did. And I don't know whether that's just me missing something, but yeah, just a general comment.
Yeah, I managed to translate this one a little bit quicker than the previous one.
Really, eh? Okay.
Yeah, I was just stuck on like there were only 2 words that I was really stuck on, and you answered my one. So I knew as soon as we were here, it would be such a simple answer.
I won't ask you to tell us which one it was.
Well, I can tell you, it was the Exato, whatever it is, from Arco.
Ersato.
I couldn't figure that out. The eta threw me off, and I didn't think it was an alpha.
An underlying one. Okay. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, Gary, I guess, you know, from the point of view of theological depth and complexity, John's prologue is famous for good reason, because there's so much depth there. But there's quite a lot here grammatically that is not necessarily complex, but certainly is interesting. So, you know, our intermittent use of I hear somebody loudly in the background. I think it might be James. Our intermittent use of imperfect tenses is interesting, in the sense of portraying a whole discussion taking place, not just a one-off moment or a tiny thing. We've got quite a lot of emphasis. They've got a few emphatics here. So grammatically, there is quite a lot happening. There's quite a few minor textual variants in the passage. And theologically, I actually think this is a very significant passage because it represents the turning point of Mark's Gospel. The key question in Mark's Gospel is found at the last verse of chapter 4, where the disciples, after seeing Jesus for a few months, ask, who can this be, or who is this? And that question continues to plague them all the way through to 8 verse 27 to 30, where they finally get it. And finally Peter is able to recognize on behalf of the 12, you are the Christ. And from that moment on, notice the exact, so you are the Christ, this is the answer to the critical question for the whole first half of Mark's Gospel. Who is this? 441 is answered in 830. You are the Christ, 829 actually. And from then, he began, erxato didasken, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer and die. And I think this began to teach doesn't mean just the verses that follow. I think he began to teach them and would continue to try to convey that the Son of Man must suffer, etc., for the remainder of his life, which was about 6 months, by my estimates. So the present tense of teaching them defines not only what he did in the immediately following verses. This teaching is an ongoing attempt to convey the mission of Christos, which is summed up here, and is immediately misunderstood here. You know, Peter seeing it through human eyes. So there's actually quite a lot going on theologically in the text, but it doesn't have the same style as of John that kind of invites, I guess, ambiguity.
Yeah, that's really what I'm saying. I mean, obviously this ties up with the Matthew 16 text and that, and I think it's a pinnacle text in terms of a theological, from a theological perspective. But I think even just researching it, there's not a lot of people that seem to comment too much on this particular text. So I found it somewhat difficult to get commentary on it, and that's why I say that's my experience so far.
Yeah, I think it's a fair comment. It's a less complicated text than John's prologue, but John's prologue is notoriously complicated. Although, ironically, it's pretty simple in terms of vocabulary, John's prologue. Like most of John's writing, most of the words that we've already learned. In general, if you read Mark, you'll find more words in Mark that you have to look up than you would in John. John tends to use very limited vocabulary, and Mark's slightly broader vocabulary. But John has an almost mystical way about his writing. Okay, we've got another 10 minutes if we need them. Any other questions you want to probe while we are here?
I just want to add, Kevin, this passage is quite famous also for being sort of part of that middle section of Mark, where you have those three occurrences of the disciples, Jesus teaching them and them misunderstanding, and so on, during that time of where he teaches about discipleship. So just to confirm what you're saying about he began to teach them. He began to teach them what kind of a Christ he is. And what was interesting to me also theologically is that part where after the confession he tells no one to tell him, he tells them to tell no one about me. That what they call that messianic secret, I think, in Mark.
Yeah.
So theologically, that's also a repeated theme. But I just have a question about one of the participles. You mentioned pros labomenos, where Peter took him aside, and it's a middle. Lab is of course the second aorist stem, so it's a middle. So can you translate it? Peter took him aside to himself.
I would think that's clearly
because you had that reflexive of the middle.
Yeah, I think that's clearly the idea. I mean, the visual picture is that Peter managed to separate him from the group so that the two of them were in private. How you convey that succinctly in English is a different question.
So my broader question then is, how often is the middle actually reflexive like that? Because I have heard some commentators say that the middle is not always reflexive. Sometimes it's lost that reflexive character, and sometimes from context you have to discard that. But here it seems to me a rather clear example of it actually being reflexive.
The general sentiment that I observe in the grammars is that most seem to think that it retains some reflexive sense generally, but that it's a very weak reflexive. And the explicit reflexive took him aside to himself probably is an over-translation. Most instances of the middle have some subtle nuance that there was some personal interest or that involved. So if you just think of the English idiom, Henny took me aside and asked me this. The English statement, you took me aside, carries the same nuance of separation from the rest of the group. So if you said that, people would understand that you took me privately to yourself, so that you could speak to me separate from the group. And thus, rightly, in my opinion, one would not translate it that he took me aside to himself. But the connotation is clearly there, that he separated Peter separated him so that they could speak privately. So he took him by himself, with himself, to himself. Now, some of that idea is present, but that it's a very subtle nuance as opposed to an explicit emphasis on the to myself bit. So my sentiment would be to translate it as he took him aside to himself would be to overemphasize the to himself bit, which is more subtle in the Greek expression, but is certainly present. So the middle here is used to convey, that Peter and them separated by themselves so that they could speak privately, which I think, take aside, in English conveys adequately.
Adequately, yeah. I have two other questions, but maybe if there's someone else who wants to ask first, I'll go later.
All right, you're still on the... Jy's nog aan die woord?
Okay, the first question I have, or comment I have that you can maybe just say something about, is in the first verse, verse 27, it says, Kai ente hodo. It was just striking to me how flexible the preposition en is. Because here it seems to basically be on. I mean, it's literally in the way. And I've come across a few cases where it can be translated by and with, and obviously we know that in is the main meaning or the most common meaning. So it seems like that preposition can be used very flexibly, because here it seems to be on the way, on the road.
I agree. The idea is in the journey, in the midst of the journey, so while they were walking along, that's kind of the idea, while they were on the road or en route or in the midst of the journey. But your comment is a fair one. So it denotes a place, being in a place, and sometimes that idiom in English requires on, as it probably does here. So idiomatically, we have on the way. I think that's the English equivalent, while they were on the way. Interestingly,
the only other...
I mean, the expression en route.
Yeah.
It seemed to at least be highly coincidental. Yeah, your other question?
It's just the construction in verse 33. Hoti u phronais tatu theu, where the article is used for seemingly stands in for a phrase for the things of God, and then ta tone anthropon, just in terms of the use of the article.
Yeah, very, very common in Greek to have an article followed by something, in this case a genitive, where you've got to supply or translate the article substantively according to its gender and number. So, Greek could use an expression like ta pragmata tu theu, or perhaps even something like ta remata, where rema sometimes means things, not words. But the flexibility of the language means that ta tu theu just works. It's the things of God, the belonging to God stuff. So that's a very common idiom in Greek, and you'll see that again and again and again, where that's the standard way of expressing this kind of thought.
Yeah, and don't they also use it like, say, Simon, son of Jonah, that's son of or something? Don't they use a similar kind of construction for that?
Yeah, you can do. There's a range of uses of the genitive, which the intermediate grammars like Wallace will get into, trying to classify them into a hierarchy. And any classification of the genitive could be construed with a thing like ta, yeah. So if the context told me that hoti simonos, for instance, let's say I had ha, and then I had two simonos. So literally the, and it's masculine singular, of Simon. If the context made it clear that it's referring to, the son of Simon or the brother of Simon, then my genitive would express relationship. So whatever function a genitive can have in reference to a full noun, it can have in a phrase like this, where the actual noun has fallen away, and all that remains is the article. So the answer is yes, and the reason it's yes is because the genitive here can have just about any function. Here, the genitive refers to possession. So you do not have in mind the things which concern or belong to God, but the things which belong to men. So it's a pretty standard possessive genitive, I think. But we could have more complex uses of the genitives in other contexts, such as the one of relationship. Okay, now we are out of time. Thanks, everyone. Hope you're enjoying working with the texts themselves. This was kind of what it was all about when you embarked on the journey. So I hope and pray that you're finding it valuable, stimulating, edifying, etc. And if you have any questions as you go along, feel free to post them on the forum, and I'll respond in text. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.